This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Polity Books, which has loads of great titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat by Ruth Milkman. Do immigrants really steal American jobs? In her timely and provocative new book, Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat, acclaimed sociologist Ruth Milkman argues that mass immigration is the effect rather than the cause of the declining fortunes of the working class. Through a careful analysis of historical data, Milkman shows that it was employers, not immigrants, who destroyed the American middle class with neoliberal policies. Non-college educated American workers have every reason to be enraged and alienated by rising inequality and the degradation of employment, Milkman argues, but their anger has been profoundly misdirected. Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat by Ruth Milkman, out now from Polity Books. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the big picture episode on China that I've been meaning to do forever. The U.S. and China find themselves in a dynamic of escalating nationalisms that mutually reinforce one another. This is disastrous for American and Chinese people because it poses the risk of military conflict and because it reinforces the power of reactionary and repressive forces at the expense of working class people in both countries. And it's disastrous for people everywhere on Earth. As long as the world's two largest economies are bent on conflict with each other, they will be reinforcing the very dynamics of the global capitalist world system that are driving this conflict, a system that perversely creates overcapacity in American, Chinese, and manufacturing sectors worldwide, even as half the world's population lacks secure access to the most basic needs. Industrialized countries are producing too much stuff. Not because everyone has what they need, but because entrenched global inequality deprives so much of the world of the means to pay for what they need. According to my two guests today, Jake Werner and Tobita Chow, a new equitable global order would meet the needs of all the world's people and thus also end structural un- and underemployment. Doing so would replace this context of zero-sum scarcity that's driving nationalism and reaction in the U.S. and China alike. In short, there is plenty of work to be done. It just can't happen in a system that depends upon this small slice of the world's more affluent consumers to create effective demand. It is that system that is deindustrializing both the U.S. and China, and so is pitting the two countries against each other. Importantly, that very same system and the conflict between the U.S. and China that it facilitates also makes confronting global warming impossible. If the U.S. and China are focused on conflict, they will not be focused on cooperation. It's pretty simple. If we stick to a zero-sum neoliberal capitalist world system, conflict is inevitable. If it is decreed that industrial policy is cheating, and that intellectual property rights are sacrosanct, as the U.S. has done, the equitable planning required to end carbon emissions won't happen. This interview covers a lot, and I will not preview it all here, but I will end this intro by emphasizing Werner and Chow's point that we on the American left cannot change this country without transforming our relationship with the world in general and China in particular. Economically and ecologically, all our futures are bound together. That might sound saccharine, but it is just basic factual truth. The American left must recapture its internationalism. Before we get rolling, this podcast exists and is provided with no paywall to everyone, regardless of your ability to pay, because those of you who can afford to support us do so at patreon.com/thedig. If you have been meaning to support us but haven't found the time yet, now is a great time to make a Christmas present to your podcast. Plus, if you contribute at least $10 a month, we will send you a free book or books in the mail. That's patreon.com/thedig. patreon.com/the dig. Second, would you like to discuss some of the books that we discuss here on the show with fellow Dig listeners and then discuss those very same books with the authors of the books? If that sounds like fun, please join a Dig book club by visiting thedigradio.com/dig-book-club. That's thedigradio.com/dig-book-club. The next book is Resource Radicals: From Petronationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador by Dig senior advisor Thea Riofrancos. Okay, here we go. Jake Werner is a historian of modern China and a postdoctoral research fellow at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. He is currently researching the emergence of great power conflict between the U.S. and China following the 2008 financial crisis and how new strategies for global development could resolve those tensions. Tobita Chow is the director of Justices Global, a special project of people's action to build a more just and sustainable global economy and defeat right-wing nationalism. His recent work focuses on the U.S.-China relationship and the growth of xenophobia under the COVID-19 crisis. Jake Werner and Tobita Chow, welcome to The Dig.
Thanks for having us, Dan.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Mike Pompeo earlier this year summed up the Trump administration's attitude towards China like so, quote, "Securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time. If we bend the knee now, our children's children may be at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party." How did we go from Steve Bannon's obsession with civilizational war with China 4 years ago to conflict with China becoming conventional wisdom, not only on the right, but across American politics? An existential threat so serious and mighty that, in Matt Iglesias' view, we can only confront it by producing 1 billion Americans. What happened?
Wow, you went straight to the heavy hitters, Mike Pompeo and Matt Iglesias, two of my personal favorites. So I think the first thing to understand is that this has been a very long time coming, the development of an increasingly antagonistic approach to China within the U.S. ruling class. It's a long-standing concern in the national security establishment, going back to, soon after the collapse of the old Cold War, and was held in check for a long time by the interests of U.S.-based multinational corporations who saw the relationship with China as being very profitable for them. But there's been a pretty significant shift in that in the past decade following the 2008 financial crash and increasingly antagonistic sentiments towards China among not all, but an increasing chunk of corporate America. And this really came to a head, it seemed, in 2018 when Trump started his trade war with China. What we heard is that attitudes hardened very rapidly, like all of a sudden, around China. And people who previously were had questions and had concerns, but were very open to discussions and different perspectives on China, very quickly their attitudes closed up. I think part of that is maybe the trade war sort of triggered a lot of pre-existing trends to sort of crystallize very quickly. I think probably another significant factor here, though, is increasing anxiety in the ruling class across the political spectrum about how divided the country has become in the wake of Trump's 2016 victory. And we saw very explicitly from commentators in the center, the center left, and on the right, casting a vision of uniting the country around the idea of China as the central villain, that we can unite the country by villainizing China, and that would be the thing that we could all agree on, and we could reach across the aisle on that basis.
The Cold War provided this sort of container for U.S. politics that 9/11 only did rather briefly.
Yeah. So we saw this like explicitly from, our friend Matt Iglesias, from David Brooks, from some fairly progressive voices, actually. Across the political spectrum, a big swath of the political spectrum, the idea that this is the thing that could unite the country, that we just need the right kind of enemy, and China's the one. So I think that's been another factor of how powerful this has been on sort of the Democratic Party side of the political spectrum, is that it seems to meet this deeply felt need that they have.
Jake?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just add there that there are things going on in Asia and different sort of reorientation of Chinese policy that has exacerbated this. So I it's important to see that part of the hostility to China is being driven by internal anxieties, anxieties that are internal to the U.S. elite. It has to do with a loss of faith in the dynamism of the U.S. economy. It has to do with the increasing dependence of the U.S. economy on a fairly narrow set of extremely high profit sectors in tech, especially, and the fact that is calling into question sort of the self-confidence of the U.S. elite. But that's also connected to the ways in which China appears to be the source of that loss of faith. So this is quite explicit in the realm of tech, where China is starting to pose as a real competitor to the dominance of U.S. corporations over these extremely high value sectors, and it actually is a real threat to the U.S. Economy as it's currently constituted. If Chinese companies were to take a large share of these high profit sectors, that would seriously damage the already very fragile U.S. growth process. And at the same time, there's also these security concerns. The Chinese military has been expanding extremely rapidly. It still is only a small fraction of the amount of resources that go into the U.S. military. But it has expanded its capacities, at least regionally, in Asia very rapidly. And the U.S.
And unlike the U.S., it doesn't need to project military power globally. It can focus it on the Pacific.
Yes, that's largely true. I mean, there is an exception in terms of China has concerns about kind of piracy and about being able to airlift its nationals out of foreign countries that they increasingly have a presence in. So there is some questions about projection that are out there. But in terms of...
And over the Gulf and the Horn of Africa and
yes,
things like that. Yes,
exactly. But largely, and the way in which this is threatening to U.S. military dominance is in the region. So yeah, in particular, with regard to Taiwan and the South China Sea have been the real sources of friction lately. And so China has been increasing its capacities because it feels threatened by the United States. And of course, the United States, which is the incumbent hegemon in the Pacific, then feels threatened by China. So you start to get a classic kind of security dilemma where in order to feel more secure, each side makes the other side feel less secure. And it goes on and on into the abyss.
Public opinion toward China has tanked all over the world this year. But at the same time in China, nationalism is on the rise. There's a widely held and rather understandable belief that their government's response to the pandemic has vindicated the Chinese system, while by contrast, the abject failure of the U.S. and European governments to tame the virus has exposed the Western model as just sclerotic and exhausted. What accounts for this divergent response to China over the pandemic, within and without China? What might the impacts of that divergent response be down the line? And is there still time for cooperation to change that dynamic? And if there is still time, is there any hope that Biden might change course given his foreign policy team?
There has been a really sharp contrast, obviously, between the ability of China to keep the virus under control, even though it started in China, and even though the early Chinese response very much resembled the response that has led to its running out of control in the US and Europe. So I think the first point to make is that China isn't some radically different civilization or something that can just keep viruses under control. Very, very much you saw like the reason that there was a disastrously delayed response is that local officials were worried about growth, economic growth, and their own legitimacy. And they just really wanted the disease to go away when it first broke out, and not really understanding its severity, they essentially suppressed the warning signs around it. And which is, of course, exactly what happened when it hit New York, and as it expanded nationally in the United States, what happened when it hit Italy. These are very common sorts of responses to protect economic activity and to protect the desire not to have something go terribly wrong on your watch when you're a political authority. So the initial response in China was very similar, but then the subsequent response was quite different. Not different, I think, because of authoritarianism or something, or certainly not because of Chinese culture. Obviously, because a number of other countries, South Korea, Japan, have effectively responded to the pandemic. So I think it has something to do with the capacities of the state and with a kind of orientation towards governing that is more like that an engineer brings to a project than it is like a financier brings to the market. And I think that's where the contrast is, that the Chinese governance is more like running a machine and less like playing the market. And the much more market-driven kind of orientation that you see in the West, in particular, particularly in the United States, is really poorly equipped to handle something like the disease. And the contrast there is there with Germany as well. So this is not like, Germany handled the disease quite well. And I think it has a lot to do with a similar sort of orientation of governance. The outcomes, I think, are going to be very important. One is, as you mentioned, the kind of loss of legitimacy of, at least in the eyes of Chinese people, of the West. So certainly the Chinese, like media everywhere, but more so, the Chinese media do not portray a very complex idea of foreign politics and foreign systems. And it's very much being taken as a propaganda opportunity to trumpet the superiority of the Chinese authoritarian system. So even though I don't think authoritarianism can be credited for this, that is certainly the direction that the Chinese media are taking. And already, ever since 2008, the legitimacy, not just legitimacy, but the sense that the West was a model for China, which was very deeply entrenched for some 20 years, that has steadily crumbled. And I think this is sort of the last blow to that. And by the same token, then the kind of sense of national self-confidence is built up against that. So I think it will bolster nationalism in China. I think I'm also very worried that because Asia as a whole has responded much more effectively, that's going to just intensify the importance of Asia in the global economy. And that in turn will intensify these anxieties within the US elite that are driving a lot of this great power hostility, because there already is this fear, but it will now become much worse, that China is going to try to exclude the United States from Asia. And the US can't afford that because the economy of Asia is the key to future growth. And so I think this is going to even more rapid shift of the center of gravity in the global economy towards Asia is going to tend to exacerbate the persistence with which the US tries to maintain its hegemony in Asia and the confidence with which China tries to push back against that.
Toby?
Yeah, you also asked about the opinions of China tanking around the world. We've also seen opinions of the US, and particularly the Trump administration, tank around the world this year. I think probably a super important part of this dynamic is the way that both the Chinese and the US ruling class have, in particular the current administration here in the US, relied heavily on nationalistic responses to their own failures in the pandemic. And the failures in the US have been much worse throughout the year than in China, but China had its fair share of failures, particularly early on. to an extent that has been effective in the US, at least on the Republican side of the political spectrum. It's been very successful domestically within China, the nationalistic narrative strategy. But, it just doesn't play well in the rest of the world. This increasingly belligerent and defensive nationalism in China plays well to the domestic audience, but not to anywhere else, not in other countries. China also engaged in a lot of, I guess we could call them unforced errors. There were these efforts in the spring at mask diplomacy, where China very successfully rapidly ramped up its production of masks and other PPE and started exporting it in a pretty transparent effort to build soft power internationally, but was just very arrogant and pushy about it in a way that ended up backfiring in a lot of cases. And there are also other diplomatic snafus, these cases of just very ugly racist discrimination against African migrants in southern China that I think
and who are businessmen who are based there to connect African business to Chinese business.
Yeah. And this went totally viral in Africa, and I think that just took the Chinese government by surprise. They didn't realize that this would be an issue.
They were seen as particularly threatening potential disease vectors for some reason, and subjected to racially specific lockdowns or something like that.
Yeah. So, the very thing that the Chinese government might rightly point out as a problem in the US, they were doing it. There are people within China doing that to other people as well. Yeah.
In terms of US anti-China politics on the right, it's gotten pretty weird. There's Steve Bannon, who's forged this close relationship with the fugitive anti-CCP Chinese billionaire Guo Wengwei. And then Falun Gong has a news site called the Epoch Times, which has become, unbeknownst to me before I read this expose in the New York Times, a top source for right-wing Trumpist propaganda online, which is truly bizarre. But to what extent has this new far-right anti-CCP, these new far-right anti-CCP alliances, to what extent have they added up to anti-China politics playing a decisive role in American politics, particularly this presidential election? Because no doubt public opinion in the US is quite sour on China. Negative opinions shot up beginning in Obama's second term and then, unsurprisingly, exploded this spring. But did Trump's strategy of blaming China meaningfully resonate in 2020 or for that matter in 2016?
In 2016, I'm not sure there's super clear evidence about that. Maybe I'm forgetting something. In 2020, there was some polling and survey work that suggested, and I think by now we're taking all polling results with a very large grain of salt. That said, there was some polling and survey work that suggested that in battleground states in particular, the Trumpist message around China was not persuading a lot of people. It is definitely resonating with Republican voters. And I think these anti-China narratives are very powerful on the right and are here to stay and are going to be a real organizing principle for their opposition throughout the Biden administration. So that is not going away on the right. But it didn't have the appeal that I think the GOP hoped it would have and that I feared it would have among Democrats and independents and undecided voters. I think this is somewhat speculative, but one reason why I think it wasn't as potent as it could have been is that the anti-China narratives from the Republican Party this year were more inconsistent than I feared they were going to be when I was sort of seeing this stuff emerge back in February and March. There's a couple things that happened there. One is that, and I did not see this coming, but the leading response, the main response from Trump and the GOP to the pandemic has been denialism throughout the year. Even as we now have 300,000 people in the US dead from this pandemic, and even as the economic pain continues to mount, they have still managed to stick with denialism as their main strategy. And the sort of anti-China scapegoating is an important part of their messaging, but it's not the main response. The main response is denialism.
And you would have expected that at some point the denialism wouldn't work anymore, and thus they'd have to scapegoat someone. But
that is what I thought was going to happen. I thought like back in February and March, I was like, okay, Trump is doing the denialism thing now, but eventually like tens of thousands of Americans are going to die, and there's going to be like overflowed hospitals, and they're going to have to realize this is a real problem. And then their only option, once they're forced to give up on denialism, is going to be going all in on scapegoating China. So it turns out that point never came, and the capacity of the right to tolerate just horrific numbers of deaths is apparently unlimited. And apparently I had like too much trust in their humanity and assumed that at some point they would admit that this is a serious problem. But no.
Well, less humanity, more that like reality ultimately provides some kind of limit.
Yes. Yeah. That there's any connection with. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The other big factor is emergence of the renewed Black Lives Matter uprising in May following the murder of George Floyd. That took over the political conversation for a good chunk of the year. And the right was forced to respond to it. And I think forced into like a really defensive posture, just not ready to take on the topic of anti-Black racism and state violence being the central topic of political conversation. And especially given the popularity of Black Lives Matter in the early weeks, they were forced into a very defensive posture and gave up for quite a period of time the sort of China bashing, and had to like pivot to figuring out what do we do around defending ourselves from Black Lives Matter.
Jake?
I agree with all that. I think the thing I would add is that another change that China politics is helping to accommodate, or is itself producing on the right, is a move beyond neoliberal principles and an increasingly open embrace of state intervention in the economy on behalf of military power. And so you see this very clearly in Marco Rubio in particular has made a number of policies around, or a number of proposals around industrial policy and regulatory restrictions on Chinese investment, as well as state encouragement of US-based investment. And this has gained pretty wide assent that because China challenges American global hegemony, therefore we have to embrace the end of the free market as the overwhelming mechanism for allocating resources. And I think that there are deeper roots to this, just that the neoliberal system has been eroding for some time, and the sort of hunger for something that could go beyond it is widespread. It's not just on the right, it's everywhere. But the elite on the right has had a difficult time articulating an alternative. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is that China gives them the language through which they can talk about a kind of society that goes beyond neoliberal principles that they think they can sell politically. And that I'm really quite worried about that, because there's also a democratic version of the same kind of argument that's very strong. And you could actually see the makings of a sort of new governing consensus around a Cold War logic of growth.
One last question on U.S. domestic politics for now. You write, quote, "The trade war and the broader escalation in the U.S.-China rivalry rely upon and also reinforce long-standing racist stereotypes about Chinese people and other Asians. In the United States and much of the Western world, Asians are widely seen as a step removed from robots, obedient, efficient, disciplined, with an affinity for self-denial, but lacking capacity for play, creativity, emotion, autonomy, and deep relationships with others. In other words, human capacities that are useful for work are overdeveloped, while all other aspects of humanity that do not directly contribute to work are degraded. These racist ideas make it easy to imagine that all members of the Chinese diaspora are potential tools of the Chinese state. obscuring the ways in which the experiences and struggles of poor and working people in the US are shared by their counterparts in China and making solidarity unimaginable. I definitely agree that anti-Asian racism is key to shaping American attitudes towards China and thus U.S. policy towards China. But to what extent is it remaking American racism? The anti-Asian racism accompanying the conflict with China doesn't seem comparable to the Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism that accompanied the war on terror, at least not yet. Are you worried about a kind of return to the sort of anti-Asian racism produced by anti-Japanese sentiment in the 1980s when Chinese American Vincent Chin was beaten to death?
Yeah, I'm worried about that potential. So I agree that we haven't seen the same sort of rapid escalation that we saw under the war on terror. I think, that said, the trends this year have been very alarming. There has been quite a spike in incidents of anti-Asian harassment and assault, in some cases, violent assault. And this targets both people of Chinese descent as well as people from like a broad range of Asian countries that the majority of this country can't be bothered to tell apart from Chinese. I think there's even
the
been
same way that Islamophobia led to Sikhs being targeted.
Yeah. Exactly. I think there's even been incidents of like indigenous people being targeted with like anti-Chinese racism. So we don't have very discerning racists in this country. So I do worry about the potential for this to get significantly worse. I think like anti-Asian racism for a long time now has not been at the forefront of people's minds. So it's there, but it's relatively shallow. And, part of what we did this work is we did some messaging work, like calling into voters in Michigan and Pennsylvania and talking to them about some of these issues.
This is the deep canvassing work that you were doing with People's Action?
Yeah, that's right. Talking specifically about what people were hearing and feeling about the pandemic and the role of China. And we surfaced a lot of these anti-China sentiments that we knew were out there, surfaced some anti-Chinese racism. But my overall impression was that these attitudes are fairly widespread, but still quite shallow. They're not deeply processed and digested in people's hearts and minds. So they're there, but they haven't taken like very deep root. But we know from, from history that this can change.
Alarmingly, if we're looking to a war on terror analogy, I think the single most surprising thing I discovered researching my book is that it was not immediately after 9/11, but more in the mid-aughts that Islamophobia truly took off in the U.S. It's clear from polling data, hate crime data, the tenor of political debate, everything. It's not popularly remembered as such, but it was really as the war on terror got turned bad, like obviously bad, and popular support for it fell, that all the animus, all of the energy that had been popular energy that had been pumped into supporting the war on terror was, as it turned into a permanent disaster, redeployed against Muslims in the U.S. And that shows is that maybe the groundwork is perhaps being laid now for something much worse later.
I was not aware of that. That's also not how I remember that decade. That's very alarming. It makes sense now that you say it. Well, I want to read about this more. But yeah, one thought that I had before you mentioned that is, it makes, I think like a lot of what can feed into new waves of racism is not just the rhetoric that we get from racist demagogues like Trump and so on, but also the actions taken by the U.S. state and how those play out. It's like, so like in the war on terror, more so than what people were even saying about Muslims and terrorism, I think it was the actions that the U.S. government took that just demonstrated like, this is how we treat Muslims. This is how we treat the Muslim world, that through action teaches people how to feel about any Muslim or anyone who they suspect of being Muslim. And yeah, I hadn't thought about how, like, so what you bring up about the failures of the war on terror, redirecting energy into more personalized Islamophobia. Yeah, I hadn't been aware of that, but that totally makes sense as well.
Jake?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is an important point to make, that there are a lot of liberal-minded advocates of great power competition who say, we can take on China, we can compete with China, we can even cast it as the kind of organizing principle of our society, like not just foreign policy, but also what we do domestically in terms of investment and a greater role for public goods and for collective priorities. And they say, but this time we're going to have great power competition without any racism, and also I think they imagine it's not going to have massive international violence. And to me, that just is really a fantasy. That once we have restructured the form of growth and social reproduction in this country and in the world around national identities, that is just inevitably going to push people to think in more racially exclusionary ways. And it's going to build up hostility towards people who are imagined to be foreign. And that will apply both to Chinese people and to Chinese Americans and other Asian Americans. And so I think it's just a really disappointing feature of the liberal embrace of anti-China politics that there is a real lack of serious analysis of what this is going to do to our society domestically. Just sort of a closing of eyes to what I think is the kind of inevitable direction it points.
Let's talk about the trade war in some detail. You write, quote, "Supporters of the trade war cloak themselves in the mantle of the national interest. But a closer look at the Trump administration's demands reveals that the trade war is being waged not on behalf of all Americans, but to increase the power of U.S. corporations against their Chinese competitors." How does this happen, that U.S. corporate interests are laundered through nationalism to appear in mystified form as worker interests? If this trade war is being waged on behalf of U.S. corporate interests, are you saying that U.S. corporate interests are actually and intentionally pushing it, or is it more Trump managing and reconciling the affairs of the bourgeoisie in ways that bourgeoisie might not appreciate are in their interests?
I think we should see the state as operating in two ways that are different from the way that corporate leaders think. One is there's a longer time horizon, so there's an ability to sort of look beyond the next quarter's profit reports and think about what the conditions for corporate profitability will be 10 years down the road. And second is thinking not at the level of individual corporations, but in terms of American business and the American economy and growth in the American economy as a whole. And so I don't think that I wouldn't say that the trade war was engineered by or was even really very enthusiastically supported in general by business. There are some domestic producers that were highly threatened by Chinese imports that have been very enthusiastic about the trade war, such as the steel industry. But by and large, particularly the powerful parts of corporate America are multinationals who would prefer not to see tariffs and international conflict around the economy and really want a stable business environment. So they haven't been very excited about the trade war. But I think the argument I would make is that I wouldn't say that the Trump administration is going about this very effectively. But I think the goal on the part of the Trump administration and on the part of the sort of bipartisan effort to impose pressure on China to change how its economy works is being driven by the sense that it's threatening the profitability and the markets and the possibilities to continue the domination of American companies in the global economy. And then through the magic of nationalism, that becomes the interests of the American people.
The U.S. has made three main economic demands on China in this trade war, and I want to go over them one by one. The first is, you write, quote, that China improve protections for intellectual property and end the practice of conditioning foreign investment on the transfer of advanced technology to local companies. And then you make a really insightful point, which is unfortunately buried in a footnote. In the US, this practice is often called forced technology transfer. Curiously, the word forced here refers to a voluntary contractual agreement that may include measures the U.S. company dislikes, but nonetheless accepts in order to gain the benefits on offer. If this counts as force, it would appear that other contractual arrangements such as wage labor, rent, and perhaps most voluntary social relations in capitalist society are likewise fundamentally coercive. That was brilliant. How does China use access to its markets as leverage to negotiate access to technology from foreign corporations? And then how does that then get mystified as some uniquely non-legitimate form of coercion in the pages of the New York Times?
So early in the Trump administration, the Lighthizer-led U.S. Trade Representative Office published a study on all of the economic crimes of the Chinese regime. And one of the big preoccupations was precisely forced technology transfer. And there are ways in which Chinese actors sort of steal technology in ways that are not voluntarily agreed, such as industrial espionage or hacking into corporations' computers. But this was in that report even, which obviously has an interest in framing things in a certain way. Even in that report, the overwhelming emphasis was on the so-called forced technology transfer that happens voluntarily when American companies want to gain access to the Chinese market. And the Chinese state, which has a lot of leverage because it's a huge market and because the state is very well organized on this question, is able to impose conditions on access to that market. So this happens more or less in informal ways because a lot of it is against the rules of the WTO that China has accepted. But essentially, there's conditions placed on the access of foreign companies. If they want to gain access to the Chinese market, they need to transfer a lot of their advanced technology to Chinese partners. They often have to sort of join a joint venture with Chinese corporations. And the idea on the China side is that this is a way for Chinese capitalists to become competitive with foreign capitalists. And the importance of this is, I think, pretty clear that China is the only major economy that has made a developmental leap in the neoliberal period. And it's a big part of that, not the only part, but a big part of that is the ability of the Chinese state to coerce foreign capital to help the Chinese economy move up the value chain. Other countries have not been able to accomplish that, and as a result, they've been sort of stuck in the same place in the global economic hierarchy. And it's not, I don't want to sympathize with Chinese capitalists too much, but I think in terms of the moral outrage that is circulated amongst American leaders and American opinion writers and the labor movement, the Chamber of Commerce. This is sort of a standard pose that this is outrageous. How could they do that? This is theft. This is cheating. I mean, if the possibilities of development in the global economy are defined as theft and cheating, then maybe there's something wrong with the rules of the global economy and not with those practices.
Yeah, ultimately you argue that the problem for the U.S. is that China is trying to move up the value chain, and so to escape the subordinate place to which it's been assigned within the world system. Jake, you write, quote, "For China, the central question is not trade but development. When understood from this perspective, it becomes clear that the demands Republicans and Democrats are posing are tantamount to cutting off China's path toward a wealthier society. To the Chinese leadership, this poses an existential threat. In part, you write, because the Chinese state not unreasonably sees growth as the only way to prevent social unrest. You continue, quote, Chinese leaders have concluded that the only way to manage this dangerous instability is to continue the current trajectory of development and maintain China's movement to higher value production. What they fear above all else is that China might fall into the middle income trap, in which a country's developmental trajectory levels off and stagnates well short of advanced status. Countries such as Egypt, Thailand, and Brazil are mired in such a condition, frustrating the aspirations of their people and giving rise to widespread political turmoil.
Yeah, so I think it's a extremely serious problem with U.S. discourse about China, that we treat China as this kind of unitary actor, a monolith that is not just unitary, but is sort of sinister and is trying to destroy America or something. When it's a much more straightforward explanation for most of the behavior of the Chinese elite, that they are trying to compete successfully within a capitalist global economy. And of course, the victims of competition might perceive that as something sinister directed against them. But generally, the people who are victimizing them are not trying to hurt other people. They're just trying to survive within, very difficult competitive environment. And so I think that's essentially what China is trying to do. The Chinese Communist Party is concerned above all with the social stability within the country, much more so than trying to steal jobs or something. It's just trying to keep growth and development on a particular track. So I think it's really quite understandable. The limitation is that it's all taking place within the existing structure of the global economy, which means that China is jockeying for position within an unjust hierarchy, rather than trying to change that hierarchy. And what that means is that, of course, a lot of not just the United States, but many other countries are going to feel victimized by the success of China precisely because it's a zero-sum game. If you succeed in the global economy, that means someone else loses. And I think as all progressives really should be approaching this by asking how we could change those rules so that, China can succeed without causing all these other countries to fail.
Yeah, you argue that the key issue here, the two of you argue, is not so much globalization, but overcapacity, something I talked about in my interview with Aaron Benenov not long ago. Quote, Chinese manufacturing employment has fallen steeply since 2014, and disruptions to the communities that depend on these jobs have rivaled the pain suffered in the U.S. Rust Belt. If manufacturing jobs are disappearing in China as well, then fighting with China over manufacturing employment means fighting for a larger piece of a shrinking pie. Instead, we need shared solutions to the common problem of overcapacity. Explain what overcapacity is and why it is the real problem and what it would mean to reframe the debate around it, because that would be such a different debate than the one we're having now that it's hard to even imagine. And what that would look like, a left position that went beyond this trade-off between neoliberal free trade and anti-China nationalism, particularly given that the left has these deep roots in kind of anti-free trade, anti-globalization politics, and overcapacity doesn't have the same ring to it as globalization, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I find the lack of solidarity or even like consciousness that this is a shared problem across the working class in both countries and much of the rest of the world beyond just the US and China. Yeah, I find that like kind of upsetting because there's millions of workers in China going through the same thing that workers are experiencing here in the US. I think there was like actually concerted program by the Chinese government to dial down the steel and coal industries in particular, as like these are suffering from massive overcapacity. They're aspects of like the old dirty economy that China's trying to move away from. And they had a plan to eliminate, I think it was 1.6 million jobs in those two industries over something like 2 to 3 year period. And that's just recent. Beyond that, like there's like a much older Rust Belt going back to the reform and opening up period and the reforms to these the state-owned enterprises, which were concentrated in a northeastern part of China that was sort of the industrial heartland of the Maoist economy. So there was even before these recent losses in manufacturing employment, massive job losses in manufacturing in that part of China. So this is a shared phenomenon, and
And even really shares like the same, really eerily similar geographic dynamics of sort of the northeast to the southwest.
yep. And when you read about what workers went through, what they experienced, the impacts, and how they reacted and tried to cope, it's all the same. It's all the same.
Yeah, not just losing a job, but losing an entire life world and sense of place on.
Yeah. A sense of like family stability, cost to mental health, and all of this stuff. It is identical. And yeah, it's just such a shame that we can't build more solidarity around that. And like there are huge barriers to solidarity between the US and China. So it's not just like we messed up in not doing that. Like there are real problems in building that. So around, actually, Jake, do you want to talk about sort of overcapacity from the sort of conceptual piece of it, what that means?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to say that overcapacity is only meaningful when you add in the effective demand in the economy. There is not an overcapacity of goods in the global economy, full stop, right? There are billions of people who are living on the edge of subsistence who could benefit from all the so-called overcapacity in the global economy. The problem is a lack of effective demand, and that gets to a deeper problem in the way that growth is working right now, which is the inequalities in the neoliberal global economy are so severe that there just aren't enough consumers to absorb all the things that are being produced in it. And underlying that, then there's also a deeper kind of dysfunction where the investment system is not working effectively to increase productivity in a sustained way in the global economy. So there are some really deep structural economic problems that are underlying the surface appearance of overcapacity. And when people denounce China for overcapacity, I think they're just missing this bigger picture. The problem is not that China has effectively increased the production in its economy. There are still hundreds of millions of people in China even that do not consume enough for a decent standard of living. The problem is rather that the way that the global economy is working right now is not producing enough consumer demand. And that's not going to be fixed until we get investment in those communities and countries that have been starved of capital for decades now. Precisely those billions of people who suffer extreme deprivation right now. The way that neoliberal investment works, those people are not smart places to invest because there's a very low likelihood that they'll produce returns, at least short-term returns on investment. And the kinds of investment that you might make are very piecemeal. An individual kind of corporate investment is not going to transform the economic landscape of a particular city or a particular country. And so almost certainly that's going to be a wasted investment. So what we need is a different approach to investment that can transform the economic potential in a lot of places that are currently considered barren for investment because the investment system doesn't work right. So that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is that I think we on the left do not think about this often enough or carefully enough. We tend to, Americans are maybe a particularly parochial people, but we really, if we want to get, even if we only care about what's going on in the United States, we're not going to achieve a progressive transformation of U.S. politics and U.S. society outside of a larger global transformation. Because what the United States is now has a lot to do with the position it occupies in global capitalism. And just fundamentally, capitalism is a global system, and we can't conceptualize it from the standpoint of individual countries. And I think that also helps think through the U.S.-China hostility, that rather than seeing the conflict in terms of a national binary, that it's the U.S. and everything it represents against China and everything it represents, we need to contextualize what's going on in both countries in terms of the larger structure of the global economy that's currently putting them at odds with each other and increasingly sort of shoving them against each other in ways that make each blame the other for the insecurity and anxiety that millions of people are feeling for good reason. We really need to step back and conceptualize it in that way, or else we can't solve the U.S.-China conflict. We can't solve the question of development. We can't even solve the question of domestic U.S. politics unless we start thinking at that level.
And just to add to that, all the issues that Jake talked about that we need to address here around global inequality and how neoliberal models of investment are increasingly dysfunctional and failing to address these problems and in fact feeding into them. The sort of program that could address these problems would also be consistent with a model of a global Green New Deal to intentionally implement green industrial policy, to push investment into clean energy infrastructure all around the world, including into these huge swaths of the global south that are suffering from long-term disinvestment. And yeah, that can put us on a path to addressing this problem of global overcapacity. So yeah, by the standards of current demand in the global economy, there is massive overcapacity in the steel industry, and that's a major source of tensions between the US and China. It's definitely something that the Trump administration cared tremendously about. If we had something like a global Green New Deal in place, and we're saying like as rapidly as possible, we are going to do whatever we need to do to scale up clean energy infrastructure everywhere and make clean energy development available to every place on the planet, would we still have a problem of overcapacity even just in the steel industry by the standards of that new economic model? Like, I'm not sure, but like that would go ways to address the problem. And in any case, like what that points us towards is the need for more industrial policy in the US and globally, and for it to be coordinated at an international level.
And yet China having an industrial policy is another one of the US's key economic problems with China.
Yeah, which I think is definitely from a left perspective, just getting things backwards. We need more industrial policy. We need better industrial policy. We don't need to attack China's industrial policy. That gets things completely backwards.
The Green New Deal is industrial policy.
Yeah, exactly. That's the
on
whole
some
point.
Level.
And this stuff around picking on China's industrial policy is just like trying to uphold this obsolete, discredited, neoliberal free market ideology, which even within U.S. politics is quickly losing its grip. Like, we have a lot of people in leadership in both parties who say that now here in the U.S., we need industrial policy. Like, that is the future of the U.S. economy. We need more industrial policy. And on the one hand, they're saying that while at the same time attacking China's industrial policy. And for some reason, this blatant contradiction just goes unnoticed.
Yeah, which also conveniently obscures how so many countries that are atop the world system today got there. Same with the intellectual property rights regime within which the U.S. is making these complaints about so-called forced technology transfer. How did the U.S. get its industrial technology in the first place? Well, it stole a lot of it from Britain.
Yeah, exactly. So both these like key demands that the U.S. makes of China, that the Trump administration make, that the Biden administration is signaling that it's going to continue to make around intellectual property rights and industrial policy. I think as people on the left, we need just a very clear and ruthless critique of both of these demands. This is about upholding standards that are used to keep the U.S. and key U.S. allies on top of the global economy and keep the majority of the world subordinate to them. And that's a violation of the principles of the way we want the world to work. And it is also keeping the global economy on a path of growing dysfunction. So this isn't going to work out for any of us in the long run, or even like the medium run.
And just to return to the issue of combating climate change and the prospect of a global Green New Deal, you mentioned that the Green New Deal is industrial policy, and dealing with climate change will require industrial policy. So instead of criticizing China for industrial policy, we need to cooperate on globally balanced industrial policy. And the same also goes for the intellectual property rights regime, which is an obstacle to dealing with global warming on the global level that will obviously be required. Can you explain that a little?
Yeah, just another word about the industrial policy piece. So one of the arguments that we need to make against the new Cold War politics is the urgent need for much deeper cooperation between the US and China on climate. And one important part of that argument is that China is by far, the world leader in a wide range of clean energy industries. They have massively scaled up production and productive capacity in a number of like clean energy industries. And in the US, if we're going to decarbonize our economy, and if we are committed to doing that as quickly as possible, we need to make use of the capacity that has been developed in China. And the same goes for the rest of the world. The quickest path for the US and the world as a whole to decarbonize as quickly as possible is to make use of China's clean energy industrial capacity. How did China achieve this? It is by industrial policy. The Chinese government put into place policies that would encourage the growth of these industries as quickly as possible, and it worked. So we need to do that. The entire world needs to do that. And we need to figure out how to coordinate these things together and draw upon the relative strengths that exist in the US, in China, and in other parts of the world to move a plan like this as quickly as possible. Okay, but around the point about intellectual property rights and climate change, the way that intellectual property rights operate now to hamper efforts to address climate change is that it functions to lock up access to clean energy technology in corporations mostly located in the US and other wealthy countries, although increasingly now also in China. And that leaves the rest of the global South incapable of accessing these technologies. On the one hand, that makes it more expensive than it needs to be for them to build out clean energy infrastructure within their own national economies, because in order to do that, they have to pay off some US energy company for the intellectual property rights when they could just be investing in building this stuff and rather than having to, pay whatever these rentier profits to whatever energy company. It has also been a major issue in past climate negotiations where because of the increased costs that result from intellectual property protections, global South countries feel like they cannot make the ambitious commitments that they might otherwise need to make. None of these people are climate denialists, right? All the climate denialists are here. There are no climate denialists in Bangladesh or Ethiopia or like across the global South. Like they're very clear that they are getting hurt worse than we are by climate change. So, based on that, they would have a commitment to make the most ambitious possible deals in any sort of climate agreement. But the intellectual property rights regime, as it applies to clean energy technology, holds them back from doing that. So they've a range of global South countries and China have raised in previous climate negotiations that we need a loosening of intellectual property restrictions, at least on clean energy technology, on technology that is relevant to fighting climate change, if not an entirely different way of funding clean energy research as a whole. Like there have been proposals to just throw out the existing intellectual property rights regime and come up with a new way of ensuring investment in these technologies, into like research into these technologies that isn't dependent on the promise of profits through intellectual property rights. So those demands from global South countries have been consistently blocked, and it's very predictable like who the villains have been. It's been the US, it's been the UK, the EU, Canada, Australia, and so on.
Jake?
And we're seeing a really very vivid illustration of that right now on the coronavirus vaccine, where the urgency of the need is much greater than with like climate. The disaster is much greater, but it will play out over a much longer time frame, and it's hard to sort of feel it in the present. But of course, we've been feeling nothing but urgency for a vaccine for the coronavirus for the last year almost. And right now, the rich countries that have pioneered a vaccine are in the process of preventing the poor countries from receiving the vaccine in order to protect intellectual property. So the the sort of stated values of the countries that dominate the global economy now, that the rules-based liberal order is about ensuring the welfare of the greatest welfare for the most people in the world. We're seeing very clearly that that's not actually the principle on which the global economy is running right now.
I'm Aziz Rana, and you're listening to The Dig, a great place for analysis about where we are, how we got here, and what can be done. It's my favorite podcast, and you can support it at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Benenov. Silicon Valley titans, politicians, techno-futurists, and social critics have united in arguing that we are living on the cusp of an era of rapid technological automation, heralding the end of work as we know it. But does the much-discussed rise of the robots really explain the jobs crisis that awaits us on the other side of the coronavirus? In Automation and the Future of Work, Aaron Benenov uncovers the structural economic trends that will shape our working lives far into the future. What social movements, he asks, are required to propel us into post-scarcity if technological innovation alone cannot deliver it? In response to calls for a universal basic income that would maintain a growing army of redundant workers, he offers a counter-proposal. Mike Davis called the book, quote, a powerful and persuasive explanation of why capitalism can't create jobs or generate income for a majority of humanity. I also interviewed Aaron earlier this year on this very subject. Check it out if you have not already. Automation and the Future of Work by Aaron Benenov, out now from Verso Books. There's a lot of talk about decoupling this year, particularly in terms of tech and medical goods. But I just read in the New York Times yesterday that the stratum of Americans working from home have more money than ever, and they're not spending it on services. And so they're spending that money buying more Chinese manufactured goods than ever. Plus, China still holds more than $1 trillion in U.S. debt. Are economies and supply chains actually decoupling, or is it too early to tell what's going on with our beloved Chimerica?
Yeah, it might be. I think it is too early to tell, and part of the reason I raise that is a sense of hope that maybe we can move the global economy in a different direction than the direction it seems to be going right now. Because decoupling would mean, as we've been saying, decoupling would mean the impossibility of the project of containing climate change. It would mean that dealing with this pandemic and future pandemics would be increasingly difficult. It would probably mean a dramatic increase in racism in the United States and international violence that the United States engages in. So I really do hope that we're not on a path towards decoupling. But, as you say, like the indications, there are some kind of anecdotal reasons to see that to think that the U.S. and Chinese economies are diverging, particularly when you see the kind of like internet realm where Chinese companies dominate the Chinese internet sector and American companies dominate most of the rest of the world. But even there, China is still quite connected to other countries, despite the best efforts of the Trump administration to strangle Chinese tech. But I think it's also important to say that, a lot of the trade statistics, Chinese export statistics, they capture kind of bulk numbers. They don't capture like qualitatively what's happening. And qualitatively, I think there's much more reason to be concerned, precisely because the United States is increasingly aggressive about trying to cut Chinese capital out of the American market, or trying to prevent American capital from entering the Chinese market, trying to cut off Chinese corporations from using high-tech products that American corporations produce, and using the extraterritorial reach of the U.S. financial system to try to force other countries to accept those same restrictions, and is pursuing
around 5G, for example.
Yes, exactly. There's there's been a worldwide diplomatic offensive that started in the Obama administration, but really ramped up under Trump to try to prevent other countries from welcoming Huawei, which is the most important Chinese, certainly private multinational company, from becoming the source of 5G infrastructure, which it is a likely supplier because it provides a good product at a very low cost. And the U.S. has spent a lot of diplomatic capital trying to make sure that other countries, particularly the rich allies of the United States, don't bring Huawei into their networks.
Even going so far, if I remember correctly, as to threaten to exclude countries from the Five Eyes intelligence sharing if they used Huawei.
It's been very heavy-handed, particularly when it came to the UK.
There's this widespread sense, both in the U.S. and China, that China is on a path to displace U.S. hegemony. And this is, again, shared in China and the U.S., and people in both countries agree on that as sort of a premise and draw different conclusions as to whether that is a good or bad thing. And in both countries, I think people look to the decline of Britain and the rise of the U.S. as a historical analogy. Do you think that's right, or does it miss some important fundamental things about the structure of today's capitalist world system?
I think it misses huge aspects of the structure of global capitalist society right now. It's just a tremendous fantasy, both the version in the US, which is attached with horror, and the version in China, which is all about like nationalistic pride. Where to start? So first thing is the structure of the global economy. We have seen this dramatic rise in China's economy, but it has been and continues to be dependent on exporting goods, mainly to the U.S., but also to Europe, but mainly to the U.S. So there's heavy interdependence between the two countries, and that form of interdependence is in turn dependent on U.S. domination of the global economy. So is there some potential that China could break out of that, like over the long run of like maybe a decade or two? Things are unpredictable, anything could happen. But at the moment, there is no sign that China is going to be able to accomplish any maneuver like that. Another aspect of gaining global hegemony is military. And again, here, there's no sign that China is going to come anywhere close to competing with the US for global military hegemony anytime soon. Like right now, the Chinese military is focused on trying to prevent the US military and US allies from strangling China in sort of its own backyard. That's where Chinese military power is at. And like the aspiration of displacing the US is like, the world's police force is not yet visible on the horizon. And then finally, global hegemony is not just about power and force. It's also about a sense of legitimacy. And you have to have some level of buy-in around the world. You have to have, enough of the people who matter in enough of the countries who matter in the global economy in order to run it. And as we talked about earlier, China at the moment is not on a path to achieving that kind of global legitimacy. So again, if you look 10, 20, 30 years out, like who knows? But right now, this idea of China, the imminent demise of U.S. global power and the rise of China to replace it that's just a fantasy.
Jake?
I think we should be aware, though, of what the possibilities are. I think I would maybe, if you want to draw a parallel to the rise of the United States, China is maybe where the U.S. was circa 1910 or something, where the existing great powers that dominated the world could sort of feel this rising power on their edges, and it was a source of anxiety. But at the same time, the United States itself just had neither the internal capacity nor the desire to step out and take over the world in that way. But at the same time, there were these potentials that were being developed within the United States that pointed in that direction. And over the course of the next then 30 years, those potentials developed further and emerged and were catalyzed by the Depression in some ways, and then particularly, of course, World War II. And you see some similar things in China. There is an ability of the Chinese diplomatically to speak to one of the key pillars of hegemony is to provide global public goods. And the United States has been doing that in ways that I don't think are terribly progressive, but that were recognized by elites around the world in the neoliberal era in the form of ensuring the free movement of commerce on the seas and through the sky, and as well as putting together the rules of commerce through the WTO system.
The Bretton Woods institutions.
Yeah, addressing the crises as this, as the system produces ever more crises, then there has to be an institutional infrastructure to try to handle them. And all of those ways in which the U.S. provided global public goods. And this is what the U.S. foreign policy elite has in mind when they talk about the need for American hegemony. They're not sort of like sitting at home cackling and rubbing their hands together and being like, we control the world. They, really believe that this is an important role that the U.S. has to play. And if the U.S. doesn't play this role, no one else will. I think the thing that is usually evaded there is the possibility of the U.S. playing that role in a different way that created a different form of global governance, which the U.S. has consistently been hostile to. But they really, they believe that the U.S. is providing these global public goods, and the U.S. has been. I think the problem is that entire system of global growth has broken down, and the desire within the United States to continue to play that role is eroding, and the sort of legitimacy of that form of global growth globally is severely eroded. And we're not really seeing something to replace it. China is not stepping forward to replace it. It's sort of offering some things that I think speak to some of the desires out there, with the Belt and Road Initiative and talking about development and various Chinese foreign policy slogans about a shared community of destiny. These are very vague. They don't really have much content, but it does sort of speak, I think, to the needs of the global system in a way that the U.S. is not speaking to those needs. Trump certainly didn't speak to, but even the backward-looking Biden foreign policy team, which is kind of imagining a reinvigoration of that previous role, I think has not really taken account of the ways in which the global system has changed. And that role for the United States is no longer, it's not going to work the same way that it did 10 to 20 years ago. And so I think that's going to cause that's going to be another kind of source of frustration and anxiety within the U.S. foreign policy establishment as they try to revive the old role of the U.S. overseeing the neoliberal global system, and finding that it just doesn't work that way anymore. But continuously failing to be introspective about that and understand that that's a problem with the system rather than a problem with these foreigners who just can't see what's good for them and aren't accepting it. So I think there is a vacuum that is opening up, but
it's very unclear that China will be able to fill it. The new data out on the Belt and Road Initiative showing that lending by the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China fell from a 2016 high of $75 billion to just $4 billion in 2019. And that's before the pandemic ripped through global South economies.
Right. Yes, there seems to have been a big change late 2017, early 2018. The data you're talking about is just for the main development lenders, which is sort of functionally equivalent maybe to the World Bank. And it's interesting if you look at that whole data set, those two China development lenders have lent almost exactly the same amount of money as the World Bank has lent over this 10 plus year period. So this is a very significant footprint in the global financial system that those two bodies opened up. But of course, they're not the only thing in the Chinese credit ecology. There's a lot of state-owned companies. There are a lot of commercial lenders. which are usually state-owned but are lending on commercial criteria rather than development criteria. So that set of data doesn't reflect the entirety of China's financial impact on the world, but other quantifications show a similar kind of sharp drop after 2017 in Chinese foreign direct investment and lending to overseas. And it's still an open question for me what exactly is driving that, because it really starts prior to the trade war beginning in earnest. The trade war really started in mid-2018, and it seems that this drop-off began before then. There has been a number of serious instabilities in the Chinese economy that really shook the leadership and led to a much stronger assertion of state power over the economy especially since 2015.
And does this involve heavily indebted state-owned enterprises?
Yes. Yeah, but a big question, that's an underlying problem that has not emerged as a kind of crisis point. The crisis points have been more in the market parts of the economy, like in the stock market, as well as there was a serious concern in 2016, 2017 that a lot of Chinese capital was sort of flooding out of the economy and causing the currency to suffer a lot of instability. A lot of that was just corrupt entrepreneurs and officials who wanted to get their money out someplace where the Chinese government couldn't get it because there was a huge anti-corruption crackdown. But a lot of that was also kind of big Chinese companies that were buying up all of these sort of high-profile foreign properties, and the central government just decided to shut it down. So I think there has been sort of a reorientation within the economy to focus more internally on developing, just as we talked about earlier in response to the trade war. One of the things the trade war has revealed to the Chinese leadership is how vulnerable the Chinese industrial ecosystem is. Even though Chinese companies really dominate industry as a broad category, there are certain sectors that are strategically very important, particularly the high-tech ones like computer chips, that China is very weak on. And the trade war has intensified this sense that amongst the leadership that we have to see to the strength of the internal economy before we go out and start trying to assemble a world-spanning alliance system with which we could compete with the United States. So, yes, I mean, to go back to the original point there, I think it's very unlikely in the short term that China has these aspirations or would have the capacity to make good on the aspiration for global hegemony, even if that were a desire within the leadership.
Could scaling back Belt and Road also be a reflection of concerns over the borrowing country's debt burden?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there's the pandemic has really increased these pressures, but even before then, the kind of unsustainability of increasing indebtedness amongst a handful of countries that were taking huge amounts of Chinese credit was becoming very clear. And now the pandemic has significantly exacerbated that problem. And I think a lot of the economic leaders in China are starting to ask themselves, is this worth the trouble? We go out, we lend all this money. The Western media and leaders vilify us for trying to take over other countries, and then the debts go bad, and it seems like more trouble than it's worth. So I think that's definitely another kind of dynamic. The anytime we want to talk about the Chinese presence in foreign countries, we really need to be more careful than I think the media generally are in saying that there are a bunch of different interests involved here. There are diplomats, there are financial officials, there are state-owned companies, there are provincial officials who have their own provincial level state-owned companies that they're trying to encourage in foreign investments. It's just an extremely fragmented landscape of interests within China that are engaged in these decisions and pulling them in a bunch of different directions. And if we want to be serious about trying to analyze what's going on with the Chinese presence in the rest of the world, we have to be much more attentive to that fragmentation. than we usually are.
There's also the interests of like the target countries, the countries where this investment goes into. And, without a doubt, Chinese capital has an enormous amount of power over these countries, but the priorities and the felt needs of companies and political leaders in these target countries go a long ways to determining how these investments play out. So there's the sort of dominant narrative is of a monolithic, highly unified China just imposing its will on these countries in the global south. And, we should be very clear that there are some important and legitimate critiques of how this stuff plays out. But like that dominant narrative is a huge oversimplification.
There's this chapter by the scholar Qingquan Li that you sent me that was fascinating, comparing the Chinese role in the Zambian copper industry and then also in the construction industry. And Qingquan Li wrote, quote, "The basic difference is that Chinese state capital was driven by a logic of encompassing accumulation, whereas global private capital was driven by shareholder value maximization. Encompassing accumulation subscribed to a multi-dimension conception of profit that included not only financial returns, but also political patronage and influence and access to commodities at their source. The significance of copper for China's state-owned mining sector lies in both its exchange value, that is, its profit-making potential, and its use value, its intrinsic value as a raw material input needed for Chinese industry." And then, there's an assessment of the construction industry and lending, which operates on rather different principles. And yet, time and again, there's an attempt to sort of project this unitary strategic orientation onto the Chinese state in terms of how it behaves economically in the world.
That book, The Spectre of Global China, is, I think, just essential reading for understanding. It's just a brilliant study of how Chinese investment in Zambia played out. But I think it's essential for understanding China's global investments in general. One thing that she makes very clear is the variety of interests on the Chinese side and how they interplay and can sometimes compete with each other. Another thing that she brings out very clearly is the impact of particularly political leaders and what they want to get out of the relationship, as well as the power of sort of like populist political movements and political leaders who are powered by them to make effective demands of some forms of Chinese capital. And she really identifies Chinese state-owned enterprise investment into the copper industry in Zambia is a place where China both had a deep commitment to long-term development in this industry in Zambia and was willing to sacrifice short-term profits in a way that other sources of global capital involved in Zambia's copper industry were not willing to do.
Because they didn't just want the profit from the copper, they wanted the copper.
They wanted the copper. They wanted a steady long-term supply of copper. They also wanted to cultivate the China-Zambia relationship, that diplomatic relationship over the long term. And because of that commitment, that also increased the space for movements and political leaders to make increased demands successfully of the Chinese firms that were running this one mine. And there are some successes there that were not matched in mines run by other sources of global capital. And she gives a series of examples. In the 2008 economic crisis, a mine run by a Chinese firm refused to engage in retrenchment, like layoffs or anything like that. Like they were like, okay, the price of copper is going down. This mine is less profitable. But we're going to keep production running because our priority is having a steady long-term supply of copper. So we're going to sort of set aside the market forces for now and keep this running, which apparently built up a significant amount of goodwill within Zambia, which China badly needed. Another example was Zambia. The Zambian government for some time has wanted to try to move up the value chain in the copper industry and shift from just being a country that extracts copper and build industries that process copper as well. And it was, again, a Chinese state-owned enterprise, and I think with cooperation from the Chinese state that came through with some long-term investments in an economic zone where these value-added industries would have a chance to build up. And other sources of global capital were not willing to do that because it was not going to pay off in terms of short-term profits. But this source of Chinese capital was willing to make the longer-term bet. And again, it's because they had these other priorities. So that's not to say, and Li's work has sometimes been, I think, incorrectly characterized as sort of apologetics on behalf of Chinese capital. It is not that. Like, this is not to say that Chinese capital is a good actor. It is to say that there are certain forms of Chinese capital which in certain circumstances will respond more positively to public pressure, particularly when it's backed up by strong movements, political movements. Yeah, so that's the point to make there. We should also mention that Qin Kuan-Li is she's one of the best scholars of China, and she's a professor in Hong Kong. And we're talking about these developments around China. She's recently been targeted by pro-Beijing media in Hong Kong and accused of violating the national security law that was imposed on Hong Kong by the Chinese government this year, which could put her at significant risk, and is just a demonstration of how the crackdown on Hong Kong is really threatening the prospects of coming to a better understanding of what's going on in China and building a progressive alternative.
You write, quote, "It would be naive to dismiss the possibility of U.S.-China military confrontation erupting." That's pretty scary. How might it happen? The South China Sea or over Taiwan? What are the most likely points where the U.S. and China could slip either intentionally or accidentally into conflict?
I think those are two flashpoints that get a lot of attention. So in the South China Sea, there could be like an accidental slip into open conflict. The same thing could happen around Taiwan. Taiwan is where there is sort of the greater threat from the Chinese military, just like open threats to invade. But I think a thing that also concerns me greatly, aside from those two potential flashpoints, is the risk of like proxy wars in other parts of the world, like potentially in Africa. We're worried about like the potential of this breaking out someplace in Africa because, well, first of all, that happened in the old Cold War. And so, this drawdown in Belt and Road Initiative funding maybe changes things. But before that, China was on a path to building a lot stronger economic relationships that the U.S. was not in a position to compete with. And the major strength that the U.S. has on the African continent is AFRICOM. It's the U.S. military presence there. So there's a fear that I have that at some point, the U.S. is going to decide that it's got to use the one advantage that it has to compete with China over Africa. And we have to realize also that in the eyes of both the U.S. state and the Chinese state, African lives do not count for much. So this could appear to both sides as like a low-cost proxy conflict that is, relatively safe to engage in versus both sides know anything with Taiwan is going to spiral rapidly out of control. So that maybe, I think that does provide a kind of a check on military escalation there. But that same sort of check does not exist in other parts of the world.
China's neighbors view its actions in the South China Sea or in the Himalayas as an imperial aggressive incursion. But from China's perspective, they're surrounded on all sides in their own neighborhood by U.S. military bases in a region where they should be natural regional hegemon. What's your assessment of China's regional geopolitical conflicts? Is there a way of analyzing them from a position that neither pathologizes China from the unmarked perspective of U.S. empire, which is what we typically read in the paper here, nor in reaction to that, somehow dresses up China's actions as some sort of third worldist resistance to U.S. empire. Is there a potential exit from this sort of dichotomous thinking?
Yes, there has to be. I mean, both of those are wrong.
Agreed.
I think the right way to start forming that answer is to again step back and look at the global system as a whole rather than focusing on individual countries within it and how the global system conditions their fears and desires that then lead to violence or to aggression. And in this case, this is happening in China for two reasons. For one reason is that China feels extremely vulnerable. As you say, it's surrounded by U.S. military bases or U.S. Allies. India is sort of maybe emerging as a quasi-ally. Of course, there are huge American military bases in South Korea and Japan, and further south in the Western Pacific,
Guam,
and in Australia and New Zealand. There's sort of an understanding with Vietnam. The Philippines goes back and forth, but is ostensibly an ally. Thailand as well. So there's all around China, there are these U.S. allies or the U.S. presence. And a huge part of the Chinese economy relies on shipping through the South China Sea to sustain itself. And the United States currently is by far the major naval power in the South China Sea. So if the United States wanted to, it could easily blockade China and shut down the Chinese economy. And that's one of the big fears in the Chinese leadership, which has led to attempts to cultivate sources of, particularly of oil and natural gas, but other resources as well, cultivate sources in Central Asia, so that there are these overland routes rather than relying on shipping through the South China Sea. And has also led the leadership to start to militarize the South China Sea. Well, that's prejudicial framing because it's already militarized. The U.S. Navy dominates it. But China has taken these actions to start building up artificial islands that it can claim as its territory because it has these extremely, extremely expansive territorial claims to basically the entire South China Sea, which goes, thousands of kilometers beyond Chinese land territory. So that's a defensive response to the way that the global system is organized. But there's also this other response. The global system is a hierarchy. It's a hierarchy politically and economically, and that generates the desire to not be subordinate within the hierarchy, and that's both sort of a psychological desire and a practical desire, and that is what feeds nationalism ultimately. And the desire to move up in that hierarchy rather than to continue to be dictated to by the global hegemon, the United States. And that's a very explosive desire in this context, in a context where the U.S. itself feels very threatened and very unstable because of the deterioration of the economy, because of the dysfunction in politics, because, for all these reasons, that creates a lot of tension that could easily kind of blow up into some kind of military incident. And the Chinese side is pushing on this. So I want to emphasize that this is not just about pushing back against a sense of vulnerability. It's also a positive desire to become a great power, to establish oneself within that hierarchy of status, as well as the hierarchy of kind of economic power. And the reason that we need to look at the global system for this is that is being structured by the global system, that those dynamics of a rising power trying to assert itself in ways that compromise the interests of other people who are disadvantaged compared to that rising power, people in the South China Sea, people in India, wherever. That dynamic comes from the hierarchy of the global system. And if we want to address that, we can't just stop and say China is acting aggressively and that's bad. But we also can't just say the United States is acting like a hegemon and that's bad. Both of those roles and the dynamics that are playing out between them are structured by this hierarchy in the global economy. If we wanted to make the world safer and we wanted to reduce the tendency of great powers to victimize other people, we really need to address it at that level rather than just at the level of criticizing people who dominate other people.
So briefly, I'd like to go over some key historical context. You write that after the Cold War's end, quote, elites counseled cautious accommodation of China's interest in order to integrate it into the U.S.-dominated liberal international order. This approach was in line with the post-Cold War faith that all societies were converging around free markets, formal democracy, and entrepreneurial individualism as they joined a single open and interdependent global market. That vision was not just flattering to the dominant ideology of U.S. elites, but also promised a dominant position for U.S.-based multinational corporations at the top of the global economy, with the U.S. security state policing the global system. How did the U.S. at the time imagine that China would function within the global system? What, on the other hand, did post-Mao Chinese leadership want out of the arrangement? And why did that arrangement ultimately break down?
I think the U.S. elite obviously wanted to maintain the dominant position of U.S. companies and U.S. military in the world. And the idea was that China will just be a bigger version of South Korea or something and will sort of fit itself into that whole order. But there also was this other side of it that I think is a genuine point of belief, which is that the neoliberal ideals of democracy and human rights are universal, and every society will sort of transform along those lines. The end of history ideology. And I think there was reason to believe that. I don't think it was just a fantasy on their part. Like retrospectively now, a lot of people are saying, wow, people sure were naive, or they sure were like high on ideology or something to think that. But I think actually, if you look with the significant interruption of the 1989 massacre at Tiananmen Square, which set back a lot of these trends, but overall, if you look from the stretch from the late 70s until 2008, Chinese society was transforming in a broadly neoliberal direction. And that's not just economically, but also in terms of politics and pluralism. So it didn't democratize in the way that this is often understood as being the definitive version of this, but the space for political debate and criticism opened up incredibly around a wide range of issues, and the space for activism, for feminist activism, for labor activism, space for journalists and human rights lawyers. All this space opened up really, really quite remarkably. And Chinese society was moving in that direction up until 2008, 2010, that we start to see a shift there towards the end of the decade.
Well, 2008 is the financial crisis, and then 2010 is Obama's pivot to Asia, and then the attempt to create a Trans-Pacific Partnership excluding China.
Right. I think that's part of it. There was this sense that the U.S. was targeting China already quite early in the Obama administration. I don't think there was a terribly meaningful effort in that direction, but there was a lot of anxiety within the Chinese elite. And I think for similar reasons to the reasons that the American elite has been anxious over the last decade, there was a real anxiety within the Chinese Communist Party about the legitimacy of the party and the loss of popular support due to increasing inequality and due to increasing corruption and due to the slow growth of opportunities and due to the unresponsiveness of leadership to popular demands. So the Chinese elite was really anxious about a lot of this stuff. And I think that's the context within which Obama's pivot to Asia, which wasn't substantively all that significant in how it changed the U.S. presence, it still was felt to be very threatening by the Chinese leadership. But I think that the emphasis really should be in understanding this shift should be in terms of what was going on internally. But I think it's also important to kind of tie that to see that what was going on internally in China is something that was happening in parallel with societies around the world. And so right on a very similar timeline, we saw a right-wing transformation of politics in countries across the world. And we get much stronger nationalism, much more authoritarian tendencies in politics and many attempts to centralize what had previously been really decentralized and fragmented systems. You see that very strongly in China, but you see that all over the place: Turkey, India, the United States.
Well, that brings us to Xi, and obviously I think it's fair to say the most powerful Chinese leader since Mao. In U.S. coverage, that's often treated as a biographical question. What about Xi as a person led to Xi becoming powerful? But that misses this key context within which Xi's rise took place. What were the political and economic conditions in China that facilitated, that pushed, that led to a single figure centralizing so much power?
Yeah, and a lot of this kind of crystallizes just before Xi Jinping assumes the top position in the country, around this figure named Bo Xilai, who was a sort of a provincial official and was cultivating for himself a kind of populist persona. So the forms of populism that are anti-elite, that are anti-corruption, that sort of harken back to a lost golden age that we've seen around the world, that he was really embodying that and making a play for a spot on the standing committee of the Communist Party, which is the highest body of authority within the party. And that really shook the Chinese leadership. That really kind of crystallized these doubts about the legitimacy of the party because he was so popular. And I think that, of course, we can't see the internal documents here, but my interpretation of this is that, and eventually Bo Xilai was taken down. He was accused of conspiracy and a murder of a foreign businessman who had weird relations with his wife, and a whole kind of...
It's quite a story. I highly recommend looking into it for anyone who wants like a good kind of thriller.
It really is sort of a from a bad movie plot or something. So he's kind of rotting in jail now, but I think the effect that episode had on the leadership was really galvanizing. And Xi Jinping drew the conclusion that we have to do something right now about corruption, about inequality, about these forces that are making this form of populism appealing. So he tried to sort of take parts of that populism, but domesticate them within a more kind of technocratic version of that, if that's possible, a technocratic populism, in order to make sure that these popular passions didn't run out of control. And so one side of that was really dramatically increased repression of all of these previous grassroots energies, debates, critiques, activism. All of this stuff really has been shut down, and the political space in China has just disappeared. It's really a tragedy. But the other side of that is it's not just repression. I think often in the United States, it's felt like the Communist Party is just like repression and that's it. The other side of it is actually more important because it appeals quite broadly. There was an enormous anti-corruption campaign. There has been a lot of efforts put into bringing as we talked about a little bit earlier, the kind of dangerous financial dynamics that were threatening to bring the kind of big bubbles that the economy was based on, threatening to bring those down. A lot of energy has gone into taking care of those. And Xi Jinping's thinking on this was that if we're going to pull this off, we need to centralize power in this country. And again, I think a lot of the impression in the United States is that, from the first emperor to the new emperor Xi Jinping, China has always been this like centralized despotism. But that's just completely wrong. The Chinese system became extremely decentralized and fragmented over the course of the reform era since the 80s. And there are all these kinds of special interests and regional fiefdoms and state-owned companies that are very powerful. And a lot of what the anti-corruption campaign was about, and a lot of what politics within the party has been about over the last few years, is Xi Jinping trying to reassert central control over them. Not because he loves despotism. He might love despotism, but that's not ultimately the impetus here. The impetus is we need to centralize control so that we can work out all of these explosive tensions within society. And I think one of the sort of side consequences of that is that people in China, even before the pandemic, were feeling like the society was becoming more inclusive in some way. It's still extraordinarily unequal. And a lot of, because labor politics has been shut down, a lot of the problems around inequality are not being addressed. But nonetheless, there was a sense that, okay, the party is addressing popular anger. And that is giving legitimacy to Xi Jinping in a way that was not the case for his predecessor.
Well, and in terms of China's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and protesters in Hong Kong or Tibet or labor activists, you write that, quote, "We must make the case that a more cooperative, less antagonistic stance towards China may, in fact, open up more space to pressure the Chinese government. As former Obama advisor Ryan Hass and others have argued, the U.S.-China relationship has become so adversarial that China sees no benefit in yielding to U.S. demands. Hawkish policies from the U.S., including explicit calls to undermine the Chinese economy, feed the popular appeal of nationalism within China. By the same token, a posture of cooperation and recognition from the U.S. would undermine the power of Chinese nationalism. A progressive approach would allay anxieties within the Chinese leadership about economic growth, which are exacerbating China's authoritarian turn. The Xi administration's various crackdowns are all motivated in part by a fear of popular unrest as growth slows, and by a desire to mobilize the entire population to compete effectively in the zero-sum struggle for global growth. Working with China to shape a new kind of mutually beneficial global growth would weaken the case for these abusive practices. I think that's a really important argument and, really pushes against the idea that engagement with China is appeasement of China's of Chinese repression. And it seems like a clear example of the fundamental importance of the U.S. left linking domestic and international politics, because to transform the United States for Americans, obviously we must transform the U.S. government. But that transformation must also involve cooperating with China, which will in turn free up political space for the struggles of Chinese people. Otherwise, we're caught in this horrific dynamic of mutually reinforcing nationalism and conflict, which is bad for everyone.
Right, and the argument works the other way too. Like as long as hostility makes China more hostile to the United States, that's going to give more space to nationalists in the United States, which is going to consistently erode the popular support, which now is quite strong for progressive priorities. It's going to make militarism worse. It's going to make racism worse. It's going to make nationalism worse, and it's going to deprioritize the things that progressives hold dear in favor of this sort of international competition. So, again, I think we always have to be linking our domestic concerns with the shape of the global system, the dynamics that are prevalent there.
Yeah, I think it's useful to think about when the shoe is on the other foot like that, when China or any figure in the Chinese government makes a nationalistic attack on the U.S., who benefits? Even if it's a legitimate criticism of the U.S. government, who benefits? It's Marco Rubio, it's Josh Hawley, it's Donald Trump, it's Steve Bannon. It's not progressive forces. It only undermines us. And I think it works in the other direction in the same way as well.
With protests dying out there amid the pandemic and then with this repressive new security law imposed, is it just game over for the democracy movement in Hong Kong in the same way that repression in Tiananmen Square effectively did crush the movement in China at the time 3 decades ago? Or are there contradictions that remain that raw state repression can't reconcile?
I think, significant contradictions remain, and just straightforward repression and state violence. Yeah, I don't know if that's going to be sufficient on the part of the Chinese government as a strategy they use to contain those contradictions. I don't think it's game over. There continue to be activists on Hong Kong, including on the Hong Kong left, who are figuring out new ways to struggle, new ways to build power. There's part of the Hong Kong protest movement was a renewal in the Hong Kong labor movement, which I think can be a long-term source of power building and hope. So I don't think it's game over. I think the game is longer, and the path towards any kind of progress for the people of Hong Kong is a long one. So I don't think it's hopeless. I think if you're going to hold on to hope, you need to think in much longer terms. One argument that Hong Kong leftists make that we agree with is that realistically, the prospects for progress and liberation for the people of Hong Kong are linked to the ability to build solidarity with their counterparts in mainland China. They are both under the power and jurisdiction of the Chinese government. And despite the way that, it's a lot of, there's been these growing dynamics of like setting the Hong Kong people and mainland Chinese people as enemies with one another, there are a lot of shared experiences and struggles between people in Hong Kong and people in mainland China. And the way for the movement in Hong Kong to build enough power to actually stand up to the Chinese government is to build common cause with their counterparts in mainland China. Again, that's the argument of the Hong Kong left. We agree with that. The prospects to building solidarity, though, between the masses in Hong Kong and the masses in mainland China are huge, immense, and it's going to take time to work through them. But I think it is possible, and there is hope. There's not going to be quick, but it is there.
I think it's important to emphasize that with regard to Hong Kong and just as much with regard to the United States, is that the people of mainland China are suffering the same kinds of inequality and corruption and absence of accountable leadership and instability in their everyday life and lack of opportunities. And we're all really suffering the same thing, like even down to very specific things like the cost of housing or the competitiveness of like access to elite jobs or something like that. These are kind of universal. We're seeing these around the world, but the parallels with a place like Hong Kong or other cities in mainland China or the big cities in the United States is really very striking. And the biggest obstacle to understanding that and to acting in solidarity in a way that could change the real sources of those problems, which ultimately is the structure of the global economy, the biggest obstacle is precisely our inability to see those people as people who are struggling in the same way we are because they are stuck in this national monolith. That is absolutely true for the way that Americans talk about China. It's increasingly true for the way Chinese people talk about America in terms of lodging everything under this aggressive U.S. foreign policy. And it's true a lot of the ways that people in Hong Kong talk about people in mainland China and vice versa. And so I think it's the kind of one of the things I would emphasize is we need to see all of these questions in terms of the global system. And that's sort of the high level point, and then the more immediate, more relevant to organizing around these questions is we need to humanize each other and understand our struggles and not get caught up in nationalist stereotypes or nationalist antagonisms, because those are splitting people who ought to be in solidarity.
Yeah, I think like another potential source of hope to mention is organizing around these issues in the diaspora. So folks that we work with in the Hong Kong diaspora who are on the left, they talk about how in many ways it is easier to build solidarity like between Hong Kong, US, mainland China, in the diaspora in the US than it is in Hong Kong itself at this point because of just how hostile the political terrain is there. And, in history, like diaspora leftists migrating from one place or to the other have played a significant role in subsequent social movements. So, part of the work we do is with diasporas, including international students. And if we can start to build, use the space that exists, here in the U.S. to build this kind of transnational solidarity, like that can be the seeds of something new in the future. And, realistically, maybe it takes a generation or more than that. I'm happy to think in terms of that kind of time frame. And I think there's real potential there.
Jake Werner and Tobita Chow, thank you very much.
Thanks, sounds great.
Thank you.
Jake Werner is a historian of modern China and a postdoctoral research fellow at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. He is currently researching the emergence of great power conflict between the US and China following the 2008 financial crisis and how new strategies for global development could resolve those tensions. Tobita Chow is the director of Justice is Global, a special project of people's action to build a more just and sustainable global economy and defeat right-wing nationalism. His recent work focuses on the US-China relationship and the growth of Sinophobia during the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the English people at home, who look no further than the grocers where they buy their tea, are prepared to swallow all the misrepresentations which the ministry and the press choose to thrust down the public throat. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We are posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Julia Rock and Zachary Nin. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio. Same on Facebook. Please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it is on iTunes or wherever, please leave us a nice review. Those reviews, if they're positive, help introduce us to new people. But what really does that is you telling your friends about the show. Please make propaganda for us and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this thing up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.